Ladies and gentlemen, this is Tosh Berman, Tosh Talks. My special guest is this book, not an actual person. This is a book called Swinging on a Star by the poet David Trinidad. For those of you who watch my channel, my YouTube channel, you know I did a show called Tea with Tosh, and one of my guests on that show was David Trinidad. And I have known David Trinidad for some years now, though I do not see him physically on an everyday basis. He lives in Chicago. He's a professor there of literature. But I have greatly admired his poetry for many, many, many years for numerous reasons. For one, David Trinidad's work reminds me of traces of poets like James Schuer, or Frank O'Hara, or Kenneth Coach, all those poets of the New York School of Poetry. And what they have in common, including John Ashbery as well, what they have in common is, in their work is sort of appreciation or at least acknowledgement of the pop culture of their time and place. And I like reading people's works where they do comment on pop culture, either as a subject matter or as a description of whatever is happening in their work or poetry. And David Trinidad is a poet who definitely focuses on pop culture in the background, sometimes in the foreground, sometimes in the background, but there's always a strong presence of that culture. And David is approximately, if not exactly the same age as I am. So I identify with his work greatly when I read his poems because he makes reference to TV shows, to music that is something that if I don't actually appreciate or like, it's something that I at least know about. I know he had a thing about girl groups from the early 60s, and I share that love of girl groups, like the Shangri-Las, for instance, or the Supremes. And he would use these references in his work, in his poetry. And I find it always fascinating to read poetry that does have these sort of significant pop iconic people that as a reader we can share with the poet, or the poet can share it with his or her readers. And I was immediately struck by language in poetry. Poetry to me is a medium that's quite different from prose writing or any other form of other writing, or of course, cinema, theater, so forth. Poetry to me is always, in the essence, a work of 3D sculpture. Instead of using cement or concrete or wood, you're making this sculpture out of words. So the sound of the words, how one word is placed with another word, has great meaning to me and a great significance for my taste. And David Trinidad is a highly skilled poet in that even when he talks about something that could be mundane, it has meaning behind his words, or just the way the words are placed together with that particular iconic person he might be talking about. And for the past, I think for the past 10 or 12 years, David Trinidad, publisher, is a press called Turtle Point Press. And Turtle Point Press is, well, first of all, I'm a huge fan of publishing houses as well as one likes a record label. Like, for instance, if you like Factory Records, you know, it's the label of New Order and Joy Division, and you sort of got an idea of what sound they produce from that label. Atlantic Records, due to their jazz and soul music used. You know what Atlantic Records is, basically, and so forth. And a good independent press also conveys a certain type of aesthetic. And Turtle Point Press is a great press because pretty much every book I've seen of theirs or read have been of great interest. And David Trinidad's work is perfectly placed in this press. That is a perfect combination of publisher, writer, forming a union of sorts. And for my own work, I just finished writing a memoir. And that memoir is not based or heavily influenced, but though I do think about him a lot while I was writing this book, author by the name of Lord Berners. And Lord Berners is a dandified composer and writer of the early 20th century. And he wrote a childhood memoir that stays in my mind, and that stuck to me as I was writing my work. David Trinidad's poetry sticks in my mind when I write poetry as well. Trinidad has a way of taking the world in front of him and compressing it into making this beautiful form, this beautiful sculpture. And I really appreciate his talent in doing that. And I'm going to read a couple of his poems, which is a perfect example of my interest and the way he uses pop culture in his work that's very profound and important to him. But me reading this, and again, maybe because I'm the same age or the same generation as David Trinidad, I really, really identify with these works greatly. So this is a poem called The Amazing Criswell. And The Amazing Criswell, well, he's going to explain what The Amazing Criswell in his poem. The Amazing Criswell was flamboyant with spit-curled hair, a stentorian style of speaking, and a sequenced tuxedo. He owned a coffin in which he claimed to sleep. He grew up in a troubled family in Indiana with relatives who owned a funeral home, and said that he became comfortable with sleeping in caskets in the storeroom. Criswell was known for his wildly inaccurate predictions. One was that the city of Denver would be struck by a ray from space that would cause all metal to adopt the qualities of rubber, leading to a horrific accidents at amusement parks. He predicted mass cannibalism and the end of planet Earth, which he set as happening on August 18th, 1999. I had the gift, Criswell once remarked, but lost it when I started taking money for it. And that is sort of, for me, like a perfect little portrait of Criswell. Because for those of for you film lunatics, Criswell is famous for being in Plan 9 from Outer Space, the Ed Wood movie. So Criswell was another one of those eccentric characters that hung out with Ed Wood at the time, a fringe character. But anybody who likes science fiction movies or the oddballness of off Hollywood stuff definitely know who Criswell is. And it's kind of great that David Trinidad is sort of focused on that particular type of culture, as I am as well. So already I feel this great sense of a relationship I have between the poet and me, poet and the reader. Another work of his that I like is something actually, a very short poem, and this is actually very truthful. It's called Doorbell. Doorbell rang in dream. I half awoke. Was it real? No, it was a dream doorbell. Now, it seems not that important of a poem, because poems should be heavy, big subject matter. But for me, this is a big issue. Many times I wake up in the middle of the night hearing sounds such like a knock on the door or a doorbell. And I get up and it's nobody at the door, and it did not happen. It was like a dream, like a half-wake dream. So the way sound comes into my subconscious is very prominent. And very rarely have I read literature that deals with that subject matter. Yet in this 3-line poem, David totally nails it perfectly what that whole experience is like. And is it profound or is it important? Probably for most people, maybe not, or for some, it's like aha. But for me, it has a great prominence in my life. And the other great thing about David's work is that it deals with real life, but projected by another medium, maybe by cinema or by the film. And this is a poem called Orange Blood. Orange blood. The streets of San Francisco are littered with bodies of bank robbers and mobsters, prostitutes and pimps. Bullet holes in foreheads. Clothes covered with that fake orange blood they used in the 70s. Just pretend dead. No sirens. Those will be dubbed in later. Camera pans, Immaculate City. Mid-morning weekday, only a few tourists about. Everyone else is at work. Light traffic on bridges. Newly erected pyramid dominates the scene. Sky, Maya blue, virtually wiped clean by low-flying clouds. Come nightfall, even the junkies in the hate and strippers in North Beach will have a kind of innocence. Just extras on the set, as close to utopia as you could get in 1973. And now only attainable in a Dirty Harry movie. Why I love this poem is the portrait of a city, San Francisco, but seen through actually the film series Dirty Harry. If you've seen Dirty Harry, which I'm sure many of you have, it is a very visual interpretation of that city through Don Siegel, the director, the filmmaker who made Dirty Harry, and Clint Eastwood's character, how San Francisco looks. And in the 1970s, and also the TV show Streets of San Francisco that starred Carl Malden and Michael Douglas, they all convey, and Bullet, that's another film, I forgot who the director is, but Steve McQueen. But San Francisco is such a visual city, especially in the 1970s, late 60s. It has that sort of fleshed out color. And the sensibility of that city is portrayed differently in cinema than, say, in real life. As you're walking down that street, it looks different from a 1970s San Francisco, not only because the time has passed, but the whole aesthetic of a 1970s era culture looking at that particular location in that city. And David, I think, is talking about how San Francisco as a city is looked upon on a different medium in a different time era. And as I was raised during that time, watching TV and movies in the 70s, but not living in San Francisco was that image to me. Of course, I lived in San Francisco as a child, but at this time and place, as a teenager looking at Los Angeles in the 1970s for Dirty Harry movie, visually, that is San Francisco to me, though it may not really exist now, or it may not even exist then, because it's all fake in a sense. So the sensibility of David's work is like reporting something, but it's reporting for another medium, like he's getting information from another person or another medium, and he's reporting back that information. The last poem in this book, it's kind of long. I'm gonna read it to you though, because I think it's really great. It's called Ode to Buddy Holly. And I don't know about you, but I'm a huge Buddy Holly fan. So this particular poem touched me just because it's about Buddy Holly, but also David Trinidad's method of reporting a time and a place and the incident and his place in that poem, in that narrative, I think is incredible. And it's called Ode to Buddy Holly. Glass of water first. My first memory is of an airplane crash 2 years before yours. January 31st, 1957. 3.5, I sat watching black and white cartoons while my mother vacuumed in another room. There was a boom. The house shook. I remember being dragged out front and across a field toward the disaster. But how much did I actually see? It would be years before I learned what happened. 2 planes collided in the blue Southern California sky above Pacoima Junior High School, where over 200 boys were ending their athletic activities on the playground. Flaming debris rained down on them, killing 3 and injuring many others, some critically. Richie Valens was a student at the school, but wasn't there that day because he was attending his grandfather's funeral. We moved away several years later. You were newly dead. when the Golden State Freeway was built, the lot where our house stood, now a off-ramp. I wouldn't learn your name until 1971. Fresh out of Chatsworth High and newly 18 and this beginning to write, I heard Don McLean's American Pie on the radio. The disc jockey explained that the day the music died referred to the shock a dozen years earlier of your sudden death. From that moment on, you became a heroic figure, random victim, despise your fame, of indifferent fate, the beginning artist cruelly denied fulfillment of his gift. 44 years passed, 56 years since your tragic crash, and I was asked to give a poetry reading at Texas Tech University in Lubbock, where you were born and raised. Nearly 62, I happily said yes, and became obsessed in the weeks before my trip with your story, which I always only vaguely known on the internet. I scrolled through the details of your accelerated life. How when you proposed to your wife, Maria Elena, on your first date, and she suggested waiting, you said, "I don't have time." How you said that a lot, "I don't have time." How you hardly ever slept, a trait common to those who die young. How newly wed you and Maria Elena moved into the Brevoort at 11th Fifth Avenue, 2 blocks north of Washington Square. How many times in all my years in New York did I pass that address unaware that you once lived there? In apartment 4H, a matter of days before the winter dance party, you recorded your last songs, this you, your acoustic guitar, and a tape recorder. Peggy Sue Got Married was one of them. Posthumously released, studio overdubs, background vocals, and additional instrumentation all but drowned out your guitar. The recorder also captured 3 minutes and 28 seconds of you and Maria Elena talking and laughing. Also sounds like plates being put away in the kitchen. The relentless pace of the tour and poor traveling conditions, the bus kept breaking down in below zero blizzards as it zigzagged across the Midwest, worried you. Due to the bus faulty heater, your drummer was hospitalized with frostbite and left behind. Therefore, your co-headliner, Richie Valens, backed you up on drums. By the time you reached Clear Lake, Iowa, a week and a half into the tour, you had enough. You chartered a private plane to take you to the next venue late that night, right after your show. A 16-year-old girl from Minnesota with a crush on Richie took the last known photo of you on stage at the Surf Ballroom. Pleated curtains behind you, teenage admirers below. You strum your 1958 Fender Stratocaster and sing into the silver mic, the lenses of your black rimmed glasses, not yet iconic, glinting in the camera's flash. On my Mac, I look at black and white pictures of the charred fuselage of the small plane tangled in barbed wire. Scattered on the frozen field, 3 dark figures, 3 young rock and roll stars, each hunched face down, as if trying to stay warm. Fine snow had fallen after the crash and drifted lightly about the bodies and wreckage. I downloaded and listened to your hits. That'd Be the Day, Oh Boy, Maybe Baby, Think It Over, Peggy Sue, Rave It On, with its hiccupy hook and manic beat, a favorite, 59 plays on iTunes. I flew to Dallas from Chicago, changed to a smaller plane. Impossible not to think of you on the brief flight to Lubbock. I felt immediately at home in that flat, open landscape from which you sprang singing your songs. The tiny, antiquated airport, a portal into the past on the way to the hotel, cotton fields. Forever haunted, those stalks with their unpicked turfs of cloud-like white blooms. My reading wasn't until the following afternoon. I had the morning free. I planned in advance what I would do. On a clear, arid October day, I drove to your grave. I had to be there. Easy to find, a sign that's inside the cemetery pointed to the site. First row along the road. Surrounded by a dry glass, a flat headstone, engraved with your name and dates, with musical notes and leaves. Holly leaves, I realized later, an electric guitar leaning against a Grecian column. Above, stuff in the sunken vase, dusty artificial flowers, gaudy star-shaped happy birthday balloon, weather-beaten Xerox photograph, you, smiling, in your thick black glasses. How many had stood there like me, hoping to sense your presence, or sat on the flattened grass and strummed your songs? Some had left guitar picks in the deep-set letters of your name, at least a dozen of them, plastic picks of all colors, red, yellow, green, blue, fading in the intense West Texas sun. Your parents, who stoically suffered your loss into old age, buried at your side. Scattered throughout the cemetery, gray and white feathers, an occasional carcass of white-winged doves killed in the night by foxes or coyotes or red-tailed hawks or feral cats. Evidence of fresh death among the tombstones of the distantly departed. It was quiet and growing hot. A line of silver grain silos glinted in the near distance. I drove to the close-by Buddy Holly Center and looked at the glass cases full of your personal effects. Artifacts that, arranged chronically, told the story of your mid-20th century American upbringing. Childhood drawings, cowboys galloping on stallion, horses grazing in a corral, the Crayolas you colored them with, burnt sienna, yellow-green, your marbles and slingshot, hunting knives and rifles, your white high-top Converse stinkers, on which you wrote your initials in blue ballpoint ink, white t-shirt, small, and denim jacket, both with Holly written inside the collar, baseball glove, report cards, a pink autographed dog you signed All My Love on December 28th, 1954. Your yearbooks, your camera, your collection of 45s with songs by the Everly Brothers and Ray Charles and Little Richard and Bo Diddley. And a surprise, Doris Day, on labels like Domino and Decca and Checker and Roulette. Then the vestige of success, I stared at the framed gold record of Peggy Sue and at your black-rimmed glasses, lensless, in a glass case of their own. When your plane crashed, they landed in a snowbank and weren't discovered until the spring. When the snow melted, they were brought to the local sheriff's office, sealed in a manila envelope, forgotten for over 20 years, and eventually found and returned to Maria Elena, who ensured they were put on prominent display. Also in a glass case of its own, standing upright, your Fender Stratocaster, which you last played less than an hour before your death. Three-tone, sunburst, altar body, and maple neck, the tip of a white Gibson guitar pick wedged under the edge of the plastic pick guard. You always stuck a spare pick there. The guitar traveled in the bus to your next engagement while you took to the air. In the large glass case, your red and black Ariel Cyclone motorcycle, purchased on a lark in Dallas after returning from a tour. My eye went right to the round logo on the tank, Ariel. I thought of Sylvia Plath riding a horse named Ariel into a flaming sunrise. I thought of you riding a bike named Ariel on the empty stretch between Dallas and Lubbock. Two artists who made their mark and at the height of their creative powers quickly disappeared. I thought about the years I've had, 40 more than you were permitted, and what it's taken for me to fulfill myself as a poet. No shooting star, though, I known and loved and lost a few, impetuously flashing toward blackness. I needed time, I who thought when I was young that it might be better to die young. Now value and thankful for the time I've been allowed. Time to study and learn, that never stops. Time to suffer and heal, that never stops either. Time to hoard and let go, time to grow into and fully embody my words. Before leaving the Buddy Holly Center, I signed with reverence the guest book in the space that asked what brought me to Lubbock. I wrote poetry. In the gift shop, I bought a guitar pick, white like your spare. I drove back to the cemetery and placed it in the top of the E in Holly, the true spelling of your last name. I looked up at the sky, wide and untroubled, cholesterol blue, with only a few thin white streaks and sweeping mare's tails, strands of wispy cirrus clouds caused by ice crystals in the upper air. Later, after my reading, I was taken up to the 10th floor of the architecture building for a Lubbock sunset, well worth the 20-minute wait to see the sun, like a broken egg yolk slowly seep into a flat, fiery horizon. The next day I flew home, upgraded to first class, with a check for $2,000 in my carry-on. $2,000 just for reading my poems, but more than money, buddy, poetry made it possible for me to place a white guitar pick on your grave. May you never again travel without a spare. Ode to Buddy Holly by David Trinidad. And what's remarkable about this poem for me is not only the heartfelt feelings about Buddy Holly's work as an artist, but the way he compares, in a funny way, to Buddy Holly to Sylvia Plath, who is a great poet who commits suicide at a very early age. And also the Ritchie Valens, who went to high school, the same school next to where David Trinidad used to live, when that plane crash happened over the high school, and how he connects to Ritchie Valens and then Buddy Holly's fate, because Ritchie Valens died with Buddy Holly in that plane crash. He's one of the three rock stars who perished in that plane crash. And it's a beautiful poem, because it's not really poetic. You know, it has no flowery words. Every word is important in this piece. It's almost like a journalistic piece. It's like him reporting a specific time, place, but him connecting like Sylvia Plath, Ritchie Valens, going back to as a child when he experienced a plane crash or heard about the plane crash not far from his home. All of this is like fascinating sort of backdrop to what happened to Buddy Holly and David Trinidad's reactions to Buddy Holly's passing many years later, and going back to Buddy Holly's hometown for a poetry reading that he was going to do in that university. And it's just remarkable. This whole book is remarkable. I did not read the entire book. It may seem that way. But Swinging on a Star, published by the great Turtle Point Press, poems by David Trinidad. Excellent book, excellent work of poetry. And this is Tosh Berman, and this is Tosh Talks. Thank you.